The letter had described Cornelius Sawyer in 4 different ways across 4 different pages, and not one of those descriptions had been kind. Yet Della Hadley had packed her single trunk, purchased a train ticket from Cincinnati, Ohio, and boarded the westbound locomotive with something very close to a smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. It was the spring of 1882, and the West was still wild enough to swallow a woman whole if she let it. Della was 26 years old, which back home in Cincinnati had earned her a particular kind of pity, the sort dispensed with casseroles and gentle suggestions about lowering her standards. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned severely because loose hair in the Ohio humidity had a way of making her look like she had been through something, and brown eyes that people often described as serious before they knew her well enough to understand they were simply awake. She read more than was considered appropriate for a woman who ought to be thinking about domestic concerns. She had opinions about politics, land reform, and the particular cruelty of polite society. She had been engaged once to a banker's son named Gerald who used the word fine to describe everything he encountered, including her, and she had ended that engagement on a Tuesday morning over eggs calmly and without a single tear. Her cousin Mabel had been the one to answer the advertisement in the first place. "There is a cattle rancher in Barrow Creek, New Mexico Territory," Mabel had said, sliding the folded newspaper across the kitchen table. "He is looking for a wife. Says he is established, says the land is good." "He would say that," Della had replied, not looking up from her book. "His neighbors wrote in on his behalf," Mabel pressed. "There were 4 letters, Mrs. Opal Kinney wrote that he is hardworking and that the ranch is respectable. Mr. Hector Dunn wrote that he is reliable and that the man had once pulled his cart out of a ditch in a rainstorm without being asked. A reverend named Pollard wrote that Cornelius Sawyer attends church when he can manage it and contributes fairly to the community collection." "That is 3 letters," Della said. "The 4th one," Mabel said, dropping her voice slightly, "was from a Mr. James Cutter who has known Sawyer for 11 years, and he wrote that the man is difficult, that he has sharp opinions and does not easily bend to the expectations of others, and that any woman who came out there should know what she was walking into." Della had looked up from her book then. "Which letter was that?" she asked. "The last one." She had held out her hand and Mabel had passed it across the table, and Della had read it twice. James Cutter's penmanship was poor, but his honesty was immaculate. He described Cornelius Sawyer as a man who would not pretend to be softer than he was, who had his own methods for everything and resisted interference, who was not mean but was not easily warmed, who had buried a wife 7 years prior and had not let anyone close to him since, who kept his grief like a stone in his chest that he refused to put down. James Cutter had written that he supposed Sawyer needed a wife for practical reasons, and that if a woman of good sense could tolerate the friction, there might be something worth having at the other end of it. Della had set the letter down and said, "I have been looking for something with texture." Mabel had stared at her. "I am serious," Della said. "I am 30 years ahead of being buried, and I will not spend them with something smooth and easy and perfectly unremarkable. If he is difficult, at least he is something." So she wrote to Cornelius Sawyer. She did not write a shy letter. She wrote a straightforward one that described her actual self, her opinions, her reading habits, her terminated engagement, and the fact that she was capable of hard work but intended to be treated as a full person and not a domestic convenience. She told him she had read all 4 letters, including Cutter's, especially Cutter's, and that it had not frightened her off. She asked him to write back honestly, the same way his neighbor had written, without performing a version of himself designed to attract a woman who would later find him foreign. She had expected him either not to reply or to reply with offense. He had done neither. He had written back in 11 days, in handwriting that was surprisingly deliberate, each letter formed with the same kind of care a man gives to something that matters. He said he appreciated that she had not pretended to be unaware of the warning. He confirmed that James Cutter was correct. He said the ranch was 800 acres of good grazing land with a spring-fed creek, and a house he had built himself 12 years ago and expanded twice. He said the winters were cold, but not Cincinnati cold. He said he did not know what he would do with a wife who expected performance, but that if she meant what she wrote, she might not find him entirely impossible. He did not say he was looking forward to meeting her. He said he supposed they would see. She had laughed out loud at that letter, alone in the kitchen, and written back the next morning. They had exchanged 6 letters over 3 months. Each one from him was careful and plain and oddly compelling, the way a well-made fence post is compelling if you have an eye for what holds. He talked about the land with a particular reverence that was not sentimental, just honest, the way a man talks about something he understands deeply. He talked about cattle with authority. He talked about a drought the previous summer with the controlled grief of someone who had watched something precious suffer. He did not talk about himself with warmth, but he was consistent. And consistency, Della had come to believe, was worth more than warmth in the long run. When she asked him, in the 4th letter, what he expected from a wife, he had taken a week longer than usual to respond. And then he wrote that he expected companionship, and that he expected honesty, and that he was not going to pretend the physical dimension of marriage was not part of what he had in mind, which he said plainly and without apology, and that he understood if that was too direct, but that he preferred directness to misunderstanding. He said he expected to be corrected when he was wrong, as long as it was done without cruelty. He said he was not good at sentiment, but that he tried to be fair, and that fairness was perhaps more reliable than sentiment in the long run anyway. Della had read that letter 3 times and felt something shift in her chest, some tectonic thing that had been locked in place since the morning she had ended things with Gerald over eggs. She wrote back and told him that she agreed about directness, that she agreed about fairness, and that she was prepared to come to New Mexico territory in the spring if he was still willing. He wrote back in 5 days. He said he would meet her at the train station in Santa Fe and that she should send word of her arrival date. The train journey from Cincinnati to Santa Fe was 3 days long, with stops in St. Louis and Albuquerque, and Della spent much of it looking out the window at a country that became progressively less like anything she had ever seen. The Ohio River Valley gave way to the flat farms of Missouri, and Missouri gave way to the open roll of Kansas. And then gradually the land began to lift and flatten and redden, and the sky became enormous in a way that she had not expected. Not academically enormous, but physically enormous. The kind of sky that makes a person feel rearranged. She thought about the letters. She thought about the phrase difficult and what it actually meant when applied to a man. In her experience, difficult often meant complicated, and complicated meant alive in some important internal way, and she had spent 26 years surrounded by men who were easy in the worst sense of the word, easy to predict, easy to disappoint, easy to leave. Gerald had said fine about everything because nothing had ever truly gotten inside him. She suspected Cornelius Sawyer had the opposite problem. She suspected everything got inside him, and that he had developed a method of not letting it show, which was its own kind of difficulty, but was at least honest about the fact that there were depths worth defending. She arrived in Santa Fe on a Thursday morning in late April, 1882, when the cottonwood trees along the plaza were just beginning to leaf out, and the air smelled like dust and something flowering that she could not name. She stepped off the train onto the platform with her single trunk being managed by a porter, and she stood there in the considerable New Mexico sunshine and looked around. She saw him before he saw her, or perhaps at the same moment, but she had the advantage of knowing what to look for. He was tall, which the letters had not mentioned. He was perhaps 33 or 34, dark-haired with a few threads of early gray at the temples, wearing a coat that had been brushed but was permanently shaped by weather. His face was the kind that a painter would have called interesting rather than handsome, all sharp angles and a jaw that looked like it had been set in stone, and a mouth that was pressed together in a way that suggested concentration rather than displeasure, though she suspected the two expressions were similar enough on him that one might need time to learn the difference. He was holding his hat in both hands in front of him, which she would later understand was the closest he came to nervous fidgeting. Their eyes met across the platform, and neither of them smiled immediately, which felt correct to Della. She walked toward him and he walked toward her, and they met somewhere in the middle of the crowded platform with the smell of the locomotive still heavy in the air. "Miss Hadley," he said. His voice was low and level, the kind of voice that carried outdoors. "Mr. Sawyer," she said. They looked at each other for a moment that was longer than a social introduction required, longer than strangers ought to sustain, and she saw something in his face that she did not have a name for yet, something that was not quite surprise and not quite assessment but was something in between, the expression of a man who has formed an idea of something and is now revising it against reality. "You look different from what I imagined," he said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said, and the way he said it, plain and immediate with no performance around it, made her feel something warm move through her. "It is not a problem." He took her trunk from the porter without being asked, paid the man, and led her to the wagon he had hitched outside. It was a good wagon, solid made, with 2 brown horses that were well kept. She noticed the horses before she noticed the wagon, and she noticed his hands on the reins when they set off, how he handled them with a light, confident touch that told her the horses trusted him. "How long is the drive to Barrow Creek?" she asked. 4 hours, maybe a little more. The road past Cerillo's is rough." "I do not mind rough roads." He glanced at her briefly. "Your letters suggested you might not, did they?" "You have strong opinions for someone who leads with them as openly as you do," he said. It was not quite a complaint and not quite a compliment. It was an observation delivered plainly. "Is that a problem?" she asked again, because she wanted to establish the shape of how they would speak to each other. "I have not decided," he said. "Then I will wait for your decision." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shadow of one, and she filed it away like a letter worth keeping. The drive to Barrow Creek took 4.5 hours, and they talked for most of it. Not the way strangers at a social function talk, with deliberate topics and careful navigation, but the way people talk when they are side by side and looking mostly at the road, and there is no particular pressure to be charming. He told her about the land, which he did with the same unself-conscious specificity he brought to his letters. She asked him about the drought the previous summer, and he talked about it honestly, the losses, the decisions he had made, what he would do differently. She asked him about his cattle operation, and he told her in plain terms what he ran, how many head, what the grazing rotations looked like, what the market had been doing. She asked useful questions, and he answered them without condescension, which meant he was either progressive in his thinking or had simply decided she was worth answering, and she was not certain the distinction mattered much. She noticed that he did not ask her questions. Not yet. She wondered if he was cautious or uninterested, and concluded it was probably caution, which she respected more than she would have respected the eager prying of a man trying to charm her. When they came over a ridge in the late afternoon, and the valley where Barrow Creek sat opened below them, she caught her breath without meaning to. The land was extraordinary, red-earthed and wide-skied and crossed by the silver thread of a creek that caught the declining sunlight and gave it back in pieces. There were cottonwoods along the water, and beyond them the dark mass of pinon and juniper climbing the hillsides, and to the north a line of mountains that were still capped with snow in their highest places. "That is the ranch," he said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings near the creek. "The main house, the barn and the bunkhouse beyond it. The smaller structure near the creek is the smokehouse. It is beautiful," she said. He looked at the view and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know." It was the quietest form of pride she had ever heard. The main house was more than she had expected. It was built of adobe and timber, solid and low to the ground, with a covered porch along the front where 2 cane-backed chairs sat opposite each other. He had clearly made some effort for her arrival. There were curtains in the windows that looked newly hung, clean and white, and when he opened the door she saw that the main room had been organized with care. The fireplace swept, the floor swept, the large work table scrubbed. There was a bouquet of what turned out to be desert willow flowers in a jar on the table, placed there with the self-consciousness of a man who thought flowers were perhaps expected and who was not sure he had done it correctly. She noticed the flowers and said nothing about them for a moment, and then she said, "Are those desert willow?" "Yes," he said, watching her carefully. "They are lovely," she said, meaning it plainly, not as performance. He looked briefly relieved, which he concealed almost immediately under his usual expression, but she caught it. He showed her around the house. There were 3 rooms: the main living and cooking room, a bedroom which was clearly his, and a smaller room at the back which he had set up for her, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the creek. He was very clear about the sleeping arrangements, about the fact that they were not yet married, and that she would have her own room and her privacy until they decided how to proceed. He said this with a kind of careful deliberateness that suggested he had thought about how to say it and wanted to get it right. "I appreciate that," she told him. "It seemed important to be clear," he said. "You are often clear," she said. "I try to be." "I find it genuinely restful," she said, and she meant it from the bottom of herself, because she had spent years in rooms full of people being deliberately opaque about everything, and it had exhausted her in a way she had not fully named until this moment of contrast. He looked at her for a beat longer than necessary. "All right," he said, and turned to go see to the horses. Dinner that first evening was quiet and strange in the way of 2 people who are learning the acoustics of a shared space. He cooked, which surprised her, a simple supper of salt pork and beans and cornbread, well made and without apology. They ate at the work table by the light of 2 oil lamps, and he asked her, finally, a question. He asked what she had studied, because she had mentioned in the letters that she had studied, and he had been curious. She told him she had attended the Cincinnati Female Seminary for 2 years before her father's illness had required her to come home. She told him she had studied history and literature and basic sciences, and that she had continued reading on her own ever since. She told him she had opinions about the land grant situation in New Mexico Territory, which had been a topic of considerable violence and injustice, the Santa Fe Ring, and the way they had manipulated the court systems to dispossess Hispanic landowners of grants that had been legally theirs under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. He stopped eating and looked at her. "You know about the land grants," he said. It was not quite a question. "I do. Do you?" "I have seen the results," he said carefully. "There are families in this valley who have farmed the same land for 2 and 3 generations, and have had it taken from them by men in Santa Fe with lawyers and judges on their payroll. It is not right. I have said so publicly, which has not made me popular with certain people." "Is that part of why some letters described you as difficult?" she asked. Something moved in his face that might have been the beginning of a real smile. "Probably," he said. "Good," she said. They sat with that for a moment, and something settled between them, some temperature that had been slightly tense coming to a more comfortable degree. She asked him about his wife. She asked it directly because she thought directness was what he valued, and because she did not want the subject to be a ghost in the room that neither of them acknowledged. He went still for a moment, and then he set his fork down with the deliberateness of a man choosing his words. "Her name was Louise," he said. "She died in the winter of 1875. It was a fever. There was a doctor in Santa Fe, but the road was impassable, and by the time the road cleared, it was too late." "I am sorry," Della said. "It was 7 years ago," he said, in the tone of someone who says something often enough that it has become a kind of script. "Time does not necessarily reduce a thing," she said. "It just changes where you carry it." He looked at her across the lamplight, and she saw it again, that unnameable expression. And this time she thought perhaps she had a name for it: recognition. The expression of someone who has heard something said exactly the way they would have said it if they had known how to say it. He did not respond to that with words, But he picked his fork back up and they finished dinner, and afterward he poured 2 cups of coffee and carried one to her without being asked, and she received it as the thing it was. The days that followed established themselves into a rhythm that surprised her by how quickly it felt natural. She was up before dawn, which she had expected to resent and found she did not, because mornings in New Mexico territory were a different species from mornings in Ohio. The light arrived slowly and with color, rose and amber, and a particular shade of violet along the mountain ridges that she had no previous reference for. She learned to make coffee in the manner of the house, strong and black and without ceremony, and she had it ready when Cornelius came in from his first morning rounds at the corrals. They hired a woman named Esperanza Vega from the nearest settlement to help with the washing and some of the heavier domestic work 3 days a week. Esperanza was 45, broad-shouldered, and had an opinion about everything that she delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being right. She had known Cornelius Sawyer for 6 years, and she regarded Della with the frank evaluative look of a woman who intends to decide for herself what she thinks of you. On the 3rd morning, while Cornelius was out at the southern pasture and Della and Esperanza were beating rugs in the yard, Esperanza said, without particular preamble, "He is not easy." "I know," Della said. "You knew before you came." "I was told. I came anyway." Esperanza beat the rug several more times and then said, "He is a good man. But he keeps himself locked up like a strongbox. His wife died and he has not let anything in since." "How do you know I am trying to get in?" Della asked. Esperanza looked at her with an expression that suggested the question was slightly absurd. "Because you are here," she said. "Women do not come to Barrow Creek, New Mexico territory for the scenery." Della laughed, and Esperanza's expression shifted into something warmer, and they beat the rest of the rugs in a companionable silence that felt like the beginning of something. On the 5th day, Cornelius asked Della if she wanted to ride out with him to check the fences on the eastern boundary of the property. She had told him in one of the letters that she could ride, and this was broadly true. She had ridden in Ohio, though the terrain there bore no resemblance to what was in front of her now. She said yes. He saddled a gentle bay mare for her without comment on whether she needed a gentle horse, which she appreciated because she probably did. They rode out in the morning, and the land was extraordinary in a way that made her feel slightly off balance with awe, the scale of it, the depth of sky, the way the juniper scrub released its sharp, dry smell as the horses moved through it. There was a hawk hunting over the grassland to the north, high and patient, riding the thermals with the casual authority of something that has never questioned its right to be exactly where it is. Cornelius rode beside her without the compulsive conversation of someone who needs to fill silence. She liked this very much. She had been in enough company where silence was treated as a problem requiring immediate solution, and the relief of riding next to someone who simply allowed the landscape to exist without commentary made her feel relaxed in a way she had not felt in longer than she could easily remember. After a while he said, "You sit a horse well." "Better than I expected to on this terrain," she admitted. "The mare is patient. She will tell you when something is worth worrying about." "How do I know when she is telling me?" "She will tell you clearly. Horses are better at directness than people are." "Present company partially accepted," Della said. He looked at her sidelong, and this time the shadow of a smile was more pronounced. "Partially," he agreed. They found a section of fence that needed repair near the Eastern Creek crossing, and he dismounted and pulled tools from his saddlebag and went to work without the small ceremony of explaining what he was doing. She watched him work and saw what the letters had not been able to convey, the economy of his movements, the way he handled the wire and post with the confidence of someone for whom the physical world was a language he spoke natively. His hands were large and capable, and scarred in several places in the way that tools leave marks on hands that spend their life with them. She found herself watching his hands perhaps longer than was strictly necessary. She did not think about Gerald at all that day. She noticed this in the afternoon, riding back, and it felt like setting down something heavy she had been carrying without realizing. The courtship, such as it was, moved at the speed of Cornelius Sawyer, which was to say that it moved with deliberate patience, each step considered before it was taken, nothing performed for effect. He did not offer compliments easily, but when he offered one it was specific, and therefore felt like it had been earned. He told her on the 8th day that she was more practical than he had expected. He told her on the 12th day that her conversation was the best he had encountered in some time. These were not the sweeping declarations of a romantic hero in a novel. They were the observations of a precise man who gave weight to his words before he spent them, and they landed with a corresponding weight that she felt in her sternum each time. She was falling in love with him by the end of the first 2 weeks. She was aware of this and unsurprised by it, because she had understood something about herself from the first letter, that she was a woman who responded to substance, and that Cornelius Sawyer was one of the most substantially real people she had ever encountered. He was difficult in the way that truly formed things are difficult, the way a well-made lock is difficult, not hostile but requiring the right key and the right touch, and she was beginning to understand which of her qualities fit which of his needs. What surprised her was the speed at which he was, almost despite himself, falling in love with her. She saw it in small things. He had begun to linger at the table after breakfast when previously he had risen and gone straight to work. He found reasons to ride past the house when she was working in the kitchen garden. He read whatever book she left on the table after she had set it down, which she discovered because she began leaving books intentionally, and he always, within a day, picked them up and read them. And she knew because she caught him once, sitting on the porch in the last of the evening light with the copy of Thoreau she had left on the side table, reading with the concentration of someone who has found something worth reading. "Thoreau," she said from the doorway. He looked up without embarrassment at having been caught. "I disagree with several of his conclusions," he said. "Which ones?" he told her. They argued about Thoreau on the porch as the stars came out over the desert, the sky so generously populated with light that it looked like something a person had made up, and she disagreed with him about 2 of his 3 criticisms and agreed with the third, and he listened to her arguments with the focused attention of someone who takes other minds seriously, and when she made a point he found convincing he said so without qualifying it. They sat on the porch for 2 hours that night, and when she finally rose to go inside he stood also, which was courtesy, and they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling night air, and he looked at her for a long moment and said, "I think you are going to be very good for me." "You say it like it might be a problem," she said quietly. "Old habits," he said. "I know," she said, and went inside. She lay awake for a long time that night with her heart doing something complicated in her chest. On the 20th day, James Cutter came by the ranch. Cutter was a lean, weather-cut man of 50 with a gray beard and eyes that had seen a great deal and judged most of it. He rode in on a rangy dun horse at noon, and Cornelius went out to meet him while Della finished the midday meal. When they came inside together, Cutter looked at Della with the frank appraisal of the man who had written the honest letter, and he said, "You are the woman from Cincinnati." "I am," she said. "You are not what I pictured." "That appears to be the consensus," Della said, and set an extra plate on the table. Cutter sat across from her at dinner and studied her in intervals while they talked, the way a man studies something he is trying to form an honest opinion about. Cornelius watched this evaluation with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, a careful neutrality that had something protective in it, something that had not been there before. "You read his letter," Cutter said eventually, not quite asking. "Thoroughly," Della said, "and found it more compelling than the others." Cutter looked at Cornelius. "She found the warning compelling," he said. "So she told me," Cornelius said. "Well," Cutter said, and picked up his coffee and smiled at Della with genuine warmth. "I believe I may have done you both a service after all." After Cutter left that afternoon, Cornelius came into the kitchen where Della was washing up and stood in the doorway for a moment. She heard him and did not turn around. "Cutter likes you," he said. "I am glad," she said. "He does not like most people." "I know. It is in the letter." She turned around then, drying her hands on her apron, and looked at him standing in the doorway with his hat pushed back on his head and the afternoon light coming in around him. "Is his approval important to you?" "His opinion is worth something," Cornelius said. "He has known me a long time." "And does he think you are doing well?" she asked. "Bringing me here." Cornelius looked at her steadily. "He thinks," he said slowly, choosing each word, "that you are exactly what I needed and that I am too stubborn to admit it yet." "And are you," she asked, "too stubborn to admit it yet?" A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that is full rather than empty. "I am working on it," he said finally. She smiled at him, and he looked at her smile with an expression she recognized now. Recognition. The expression of someone revising. The following Saturday, Reverend Pollard came out from the settlement to perform the marriage ceremony, which they had arranged without particular drama or large gathering. Esperanza was there, and James Cutter, and two of the ranch hands, Tomás and a young man named Henry who had worked for Cornelius for 3 years, and treated him with the respectful wariness of someone who had learned to read the specific weather of a specific sky. Della wore her good dress, the deep blue wool that she had packed with exactly this occasion in mind, and Cornelius wore his best coat and had shaved that morning with exceptional care. They stood in the main room of the adobe house with the April sunlight coming through the new curtains, and made their vows to each other with the particular solemnity of two people who do not say things they do not mean. When Reverend Pollard asked if they would take each other, Cornelius said, "I will," and looked directly at her while he said it with an intensity that went through her like light through glass. Afterward, Esperanza produced a cake she had baked the day before and kept hidden, and Cutter produced a bottle of good whiskey, and they sat on the porch in the afternoon warmth and toasted the new arrangement. Cornelius sat beside her on the porch, close enough that their arms were touching, which was the most openly demonstrative he had been, and she felt the deliberateness of it, the choice to be that close, to not move away. Later, when everyone had gone and the house was quiet, she was standing at the window looking out at the creek in the moonlight, and he came to stand beside her. They had been quiet since the guests left, both of them holding the new weight of the day with care. "You are not frightened," he said. It was an observation. "No," she said. "Are you?" A pause. "Somewhat," he admitted, and the admission cost him something. She could hear it, but he made it anyway because he was trying to be honest with her as she had asked him to be. "It has been a long time since I let anything in." "I know," she said. "You might find," he said carefully, "that some of what you find difficult to unlock has to do with Louise. I'm not certain I have fully worked through everything about that, and I do not want it to cause you pain." She turned to look at him in the moonlight. His face was open in a way she had not seen it before, the careful neutrality put down for the moment. "She was part of your life," Della said. "She made you who you are in part. I am not in competition with a memory, Cornelius. I am standing here with the man she helped to build, and I am grateful for what she gave you that makes you worth knowing." He stared at her. "You are," he said, and stopped. "What?" she asked gently. "Remarkable," he said, quietly, simply, without qualification, and she felt it land in the exact center of her chest and stay there. They stood at the window together in the moonlight, and after a while his hand found hers, and they stood like that for a long time, looking out at the creek in the silver light, and it was the most natural thing she had ever felt. Marriage to Cornelius Sawyer in the summer of 1882 was not easy, because he had told her it would not be easy, and he was a man of his word. He had strong opinions about how things should be done, and he did not surrender them without cause. There were mornings when he was so contained and quiet that she felt the distance between them like a physical thing. There were evenings when some worry about the cattle or the land, or the business of the ranch settled on him like weather, and he carried it without sharing it. And she had to learn the difference between a silence that wanted to be left alone and a silence that wanted to be acknowledged without being invaded. She made mistakes. There was an afternoon in June when she rearranged the main room without consulting him, and he came in at the end of the day, and went completely still in the doorway, and she saw from his face that she had altered something that had been arranged for reasons she did not know yet, and that one of those reasons was probably Louise, and she stood there feeling terrible while he looked at the room without speaking. "I should have asked you," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tell me what you want put back." He told her, specifically and without anger, which she appreciated, and they put several things back. Not all of them, but several. And then he told her, still without anger but with some difficulty, that Louise had placed the 2 chairs where she had placed them because the light from the east window came through them at a particular time of morning, and she had liked to sit there, and that he had kept them there because it was the last piece of furniture arrangement she had chosen, and he had not been able to change it. Della looked at the chairs for a moment, and then she pulled them gently back to the position Louise had chosen and said, "They stay." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something fractured and grateful and raw all at once. "You do not have to," he said. "I want to," she said simply. "I like the morning light in this room, too." That evening he came in from the last of his work, and she was sitting in one of Louise's chairs reading by the lamp, and he stopped in the doorway again, and this time the expression on his face was different, something turning over and settling into something more whole. He came and sat across from her in the other chair, and they read in the lamplight in comfortable proximity, and it was one of the most intimate hours she had experienced. The simple fact of being chosen, of being in the space of a man's real life rather than the performance of it. The summer was hard in the way that summers in New Mexico territory are hard, brutally hot in the middle hours of the day, with the kind of sun that does not feel like warmth but like pressure. She learned the ranch. She helped with the garden that Esperanza had established, worked in the mornings before the heat became impossible, and sat with Esperanza in the shade of the porch in the afternoons, learning the management of the house, the preservation and the cooking, and the particular requirements of a household in this landscape. She also began to assist Cornelius with the business records, which she had offered in passing, and which he had accepted after a brief hesitation, and it turned out that her organizational mind was exactly what his record-keeping needed. He was meticulous about the physical work of the ranch and slightly less meticulous about the paperwork, and she created a system for the accounts and correspondence that he studied carefully, asked several pointed questions about, and then adopted without complaint, which she recognized as a significant gesture of trust from a man who did not easily defer to other methods. He noticed her doing this. He noticed a great many things about her, and she was gradually becoming aware that behind the careful neutrality of his face was a man who observed and retained with extraordinary precision. He remembered every specific thing she said. He noticed when she was tired or when something had unsettled her, and he did not respond to these states with the theatrical concern of someone who needs to be seen caring, but with the quiet practical adjustments of someone who simply addresses what is needed. A cup of coffee set beside her without comment when she was tired. A brief hand on her shoulder when she was upset about a letter from home that had brought bad news. Small, deliberate, unperformed attentions that accumulated over the summer into something that made her feel held, not constrained, held, the way good hands hold something valuable. She was deeply, specifically, wholly in love with him by August. Not the diffuse romantic feeling she had expected love to be when she was younger, the sweeping, undifferentiated warmth of a feeling one cannot quite account for. This was precise and personal. She loved him because of the specific things he was, the deliberate care of his movements, the intellectual honesty, the way he talked about the land, the way he said her name in the particular tone he used when he had figured something out and was about to tell her, the way he made decisions and stood by them, the way he had kept Louise's chairs in their place for 7 years, and would have kept them forever if she had not come to sit in one of them and make it a living piece of furniture again. She wondered sometimes if he knew. She suspected he did, because he was not an unobservant man, and because certain things had changed in the way he looked at her that could not be accounted for by simple familiarity. He looked at her the way the hawk looked at the thermals, with complete attention, as though understanding her precisely was the most important work currently in front of him. One evening in August, when the heat had broken with a dramatic late afternoon storm, and the air afterward was washed clean and smelled of wet earth and sage, they sat on the porch together watching the light return after the clouds moved east, and he said without preliminary, "I love you." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the horizon. His jaw was set with the familiar concentration, but there was color in his face that had nothing to do with the sun. "I know it is perhaps later than it should be," he said carefully, "to be saying it for the first time, and I am aware that I have not been easy to love in the months before it, but it is true and I thought you should know it." She felt the words go through her like the first clean air after the storm. "Cornelius," she said. He turned to look at her then, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, the careful neutrality entirely put down, all the stone removed from the wall. "I have loved you," she said, "since the middle of June, when you put Louise's chairs back and sat across from me in the lamplight and said nothing for 2 hours, and it was the best 2 hours I have had in my adult life." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and held it, and they sat like that in the cooling air with the purified smell of the desert all around them and the first stars beginning to appear in the east. And Della Hadley felt, for the first time in her life, that she was precisely where she was supposed to be. He kissed her properly that evening on the porch, which was not their first kiss, but was the first one that had the full weight of what they both felt behind it, and it was better than anything she had managed to imagine on the train ride out, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, the way everything about him was true. The fall brought its own rhythms and demands. The cattle needed to be moved to the lower pastures before the cold came down from the mountains, and Cornelius and his hands worked hard through October at the roundup and sorting and eventual sale at the livestock market in Santa Fe. Della went with him to Santa Fe for the sale, the first time she had been back in the territory's capital since her arrival, and she saw the city with new eyes now that it was not a strange stop on the way to somewhere else but simply the nearest large town to home. She met various people associated with the cattle trade and with the surrounding ranching community, and she noticed the particular quality of the attention she received as Cornelius Sawyer's new wife. Some of it was curiosity. Some of it was the evaluation that people give to a new member of a small community they have known for a long time. A few of the ranching wives were reserved at first, waiting to understand who she was, but Della had never had difficulty being herself plainly and consistently, and by the end of the 2 days in Santa Fe, she had made genuine acquaintances of 3 women and had been invited to a social gathering the following spring. She also witnessed, in Santa Fe, a scene that she had read about but not directly encountered: the operation of the land grant corruption that plagued the territory. 2 men in expensive suits were at the courthouse, visible through the open door as they walked past, in conference with a land speculator whose name, she discovered from Cornelius, was associated with the network of lawyers and political figures that had been systematically stripping Hispanic families of their ancestral land grants under legal pretenses that were at best questionable, and at worst deliberately fraudulent. She saw Cornelius look at the courthouse door with an expression of controlled fury, and she understood then what James Cutter's letter had meant when it said that his outspokenness had made him unpopular with certain people. "Have they tried to move on your land?" She asked him quietly. "They tried once 3 years ago. A lawyer came with papers suggesting a discrepancy in my title. I had better documentation than they expected and better legal advice than they planned for." He paused. "The family south of us, the Alcala family, was not so fortunate." "What happened to them?" "They lost 60 acres of their irrigation land to a shell company with connections to the ring. The father was a man named Benicio Alcala who had farmed that land for 30 years. His son, Miguel, still farms what remains. They lost the water access with those 60 acres and have struggled ever since. Is there nothing that can be done? Della asked. There are lawyers beginning to challenge some of the titles. The process is slow and expensive, and the courts here are not friendly to the claimants. He paused. But it is important to witness it. To say plainly that it is wrong, even when saying so costs something. I have said so publicly at the community meetings. That is why certain people would prefer I were more silent. Then do not be silent, she said. He looked at her. I have no intention of it. She took his arm on the street, and they walked on through Santa Fe, and she felt the particular pride of loving a man who knows what he stands for and does not trade it for comfort. When they returned to Barrow Creek, Della found that she had settled so completely into the life of the ranch and the valley that Cincinnati felt like something she had read about rather than somewhere she had lived. She corresponded with Mabel, who was agog with questions, and seemed relieved by the warmth of the reports. She wrote that Cornelius was exactly what his neighbor's warning had suggested, and more than any of the other letters had managed to convey. She wrote that difficult, as it turned out, was simply another word for real, and that she had spent enough time with Easy to know the difference. Mabel wrote back that she was glad, and also that she had shown the letters to her mother, who had come around to the view that Della's choices were perhaps not as alarming as originally assessed. The winter of 1882 came early and hard to Barrow Creek. The cold descended from the mountains in November with a seriousness that the previous mild weeks had not suggested, and there were several weeks in December when the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that makes the world contract and quiet. The ranch work did not stop, but it changed character, becoming about maintenance and protection, keeping the cattle in the lower pastures, keeping the water from the creek flowing, keeping the house warm enough to function in. She loved the winter evenings. The house was snug against the cold, and they sat by the fire after supper, and he read or worked on accounts or mended leather, and she read or sewed or wrote her letters, and they talked as the mood moved them, about books and land and politics and the small news of the community, and sometimes about larger things, about what they wanted from the years ahead, about what they believed and what they had decided to stop believing and what they hoped to be. He told her one of those winter evenings about the year after Louise died, which he had never talked about in any of the letters and which she had not pushed him toward, only waited until he was ready. He told her about the particular bottomlessness of that kind of grief, how he had worked the ranch mechanically for months because working was the only thing that kept the day structured, how he had built a fence around the south pasture that summer that was twice as long and twice as strong as it needed to be because his hands had needed somewhere to put the energy. How Cutter had ridden out one evening and found him working after dark by lantern light, and had simply unsaddled his horse and worked beside him without comment until the section was done, and then had ridden home. He understood that you needed to be doing something, Della said. He understood that I needed company that did not require me to be doing anything in particular, Cornelius said. He is a perceptive man when he puts his mind to it. As are you, she said. He looked at the fire. I want to do better, he said. At letting things in, I want to be better at that, for you. She put down her sewing and looked at him. You are already doing it, she said. You are doing it right now. He turned to look at her, and she reached across the space between their chairs and touched his face with her hand, and he turned into her touch with the involuntary honesty of a man who does not know how to pretend not to want something, and she felt the stone that James Cutter had described, the grief he had kept like a stone in his chest. She felt it give, not disappear, because grief does not disappear. But she felt it shift from something he was carrying alone to something he was carrying in the company of someone who did not require him to put it down, only to know he did not have to carry it alone. He covered her hand with his and held it there, and looked at her with everything in his face uncovered for once, and she thought she had never loved anything as much as she loved the man he was when he stopped being careful. In the spring of 1883, Della realized she was with child. She understood it slowly, and then all at once, the way understanding comes to a person who is paying attention to something they have not allowed themselves to fully name yet. She told Cornelius on a morning in April, nearly a full year after her arrival in Santa Fe, standing in the kitchen with the morning sun coming in through the new curtains. He went completely still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of something entering him that he needed a moment to receive. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Fairly certain, yes." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, something that was too large to be contained in his usual careful expressions. And he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her, properly, completely, without the careful calibration of a man monitoring his own impulses, and held her against him with his face in her hair and said nothing for a long time. She put her hands against his back and felt him breathing. "I want this," he said finally into her hair. "I want this very much." "I know," she said. "Are you frightened?" he asked, drawing back to look at her. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "A little," he said. "But I am also," and he paused, and she watched him look for the word with the care he always gave to words. "Glad," he said, "in a way I cannot quite account for, glad in some very large way." "Good," she said. "That is the correct response." He kissed her then, in the morning kitchen light, and she felt glad in a very large way herself, in a way that went down to the bedrock of her. That spring also brought a complication that had been building since the previous fall. A man named Aldous Price, who was associated with the land speculation network that had been moving through the territory, arrived in Barrow Creek with papers claiming a dispute over the northern boundary of Cornelius's property. It was, as Cornelius explained to Della with controlled and careful anger, the same strategy they had used on other ranchers, finding or manufacturing a technical uncertainty in the original title documents and leveraging it into a legal claim that required expensive defense. Cornelius was not unprepared. He had anticipated something of this nature since the approach 3 years before, and he had documented everything about his title with meticulous care. He had also built relationships with a lawyer in Albuquerque named Garrison who understood the territory's land issues and was not affiliated with the Santa Fe ring. He rode to Santa Fe with his documentation and spent 3 days there with Garrison sorting through the claim, and Della managed the ranch in his absence with Tomás and Henry and Esperanza, and when he came back he was exhausted and grave but not defeated. "It will hold," he said. "The claim has no real legal foundation." Garrison is confident, and when they come back with another approach, Della asked, "Then we answer that one too," he said. "I am not moving from this land." "No," she said, "neither am I." He looked at her with something fierce and grateful in his expression. "You said that," he noted, "as though this were also your land." "Is it not?" she asked. A pause. "It is," he said. "It is very much yours." The legal challenge was eventually resolved by July through the combination of Cornelius's documentation and Garrison's careful legal work and the increasingly organized resistance that ranchers and Hispanic landowners in the territory were mounting together against the systematic dispossession. The Alcala family, whose situation Cornelius had described to her, were also part of this effort. And through this shared cause Della came to know Miguel Alcala and his mother, Doña Rosa, who had the bearing of a woman who has seen considerable injustice and has been sharpened rather than reduced by it. Doña Rosa came to visit one afternoon in the summer and sat on the porch with Della and talked in the combination of Spanish and English that served as the community's shared language in this valley. And Della's Spanish was limited but improving, and Doña Rosa's English was substantial, and they got on very well. She brought a jar of preserved peaches and looked at Della's growing pregnancy with the appraising eye of a woman who has had children and knows the signs. "You are happy," Doña Rosa observed. "Very much so," Della said. "He treats you well." "He treats me as though I am a person of full capability and intelligence," Della said. which is the best treatment I can imagine. Doña Rosa smiled. He is a good man, Sawyer, difficult but good. The two often go together. They do, Della agreed. My husband was the same, Doña Rosa said, and there was both sorrow and pride in it. And Della understood that her husband was gone, and they sat in the comfortable acknowledgement of that. Two women who understood what it meant to be connected to complicated men who were worth the complication. By August, Della was large with the baby, and the summer heat was considerable, and she moved through the days with the patient endurance of a woman who understands that certain things take the time they take. Cornelius was attentive in his way, which meant that he did not fuss or hover, but that he was always precisely aware of where she was and how she was, and he did the heavier tasks of the house without being asked, and without making a point of having done them, which she recognized as one of the purest forms of love she had encountered. There were things she did not expect. He read to her in the evenings, which she had not anticipated but which revealed itself naturally when she was tired one evening and could not hold the book comfortably, and he took it from her and continued reading aloud without ceremony. And she listened to his low, careful voice reading Dickens on the porch in the late summer warmth, and fell slightly further in love with him than she had been already, which she had not believed had room to happen. He asked her one evening what she had read before she began the Dickens. She said she had been rereading some of the letters they had exchanged before she came to New Mexico, which she had kept carefully in the cedar box from her trunk. "You kept them," he said. "Of course," she said. "Did you not keep mine?" A pause. "They are in the top drawer of the desk in the office," he said. She looked at him. "I read them occasionally," he said, as though this were a perfectly matter-of-fact thing, which of course to him it probably was. "Which ones do you read?" she asked. "Mostly the third one," he said. "When you described why you decided to come, what you said about texture." She felt the warmth of that move through her completely. "What about it?" she asked softly. "It seemed," he said, and took the careful time he always took with words that mattered, like the most honest thing anyone had ever said about what they were looking for. "And it seemed like something I had been waiting a very long time for someone to say." She reached across and took his hand, and they sat in the late summer dark with the stars enormous overhead and the creek whispering in the distance and the baby turning gently in her, and it was the fullest she had ever felt. Their son was born on a late September evening in 1883, when the aspen leaves up in the mountains had turned to gold, and the air had the first edge of fall in it. The birth was attended by Doña Rosa, who had delivered many babies in her life and knew what she was doing, and by Esperanza, and it was hard in the way birth is hard but not dangerous. And when it was over, Doña Rosa put the boy in Della's arms, and he was compact and dark-haired, and was already looking at the world with an expression that she recognized immediately. "He already looks like you," she told Cornelius, who was standing in the doorway of the bedroom with the particular stunned quality of a man receiving something too large to immediately process. He came to sit beside her on the bed and looked at the baby in her arms, and she watched his face move through several things, and she saw the stone he carried, the old grief, move again, not away but toward something, toward the fact of a child in his wife's arms in the house he had built, the continuation of a life he had built, the evidence that the world had not ended when it felt like it had. "He has your eyes," Cornelius said. "He has your jaw," she said. "Which is his problem to manage?" He looked at her then with every wall entirely down, with nothing between them, and said, "Della," just her name, in his voice at that particular depth and temperature. It was the most complete sentence she had ever heard. "I know," she said. "I know." They named the boy William James Sawyer, the James for Cutter, who appeared at the ranch 2 days later with a carved wooden horse and the expression of a man who is moved and intends to manage it with dignity. He held the baby with the practiced ease of someone who had held babies before, and he said, "Hello, William James," in a gravelly tone, and the baby looked up at him with his dark, already focused eyes. "He looks like he is judging me," Cutter said. "He comes by that naturally," Della said. Cornelius made a sound that was something between a cough and a laugh, which she had come to understand was the most he generally produced in that direction. She looked at him sidelong and caught the full warmth that was underneath it before he arranged his face, and she loved him so fiercely in that moment that it felt structural. The years moved, as years in good places with good people tend to move, with the particular quality of time that is full enough that it passes quickly, but is valued enough that it is remembered in its details. The ranch prospered. Cornelius's methods were sound, and his judgment about cattle was excellent, and the seasons after the hard early drought were generally favorable, and by 1885 they had expanded the herd, and added to the barn, and repaired and replastered the entire exterior of the house. She went on riding with him. She had become a genuinely good rider by now, competent on the terrain that had seemed so foreign to her in that first spring, and she knew the land the way she knew the house, in its specifics, the names he had for different sections of the pasture, the particular sound the creek made at the rocky crossing, the way the mountains to the north changed color in different seasons and different light. This land was hers in the way she had suspected it could be, not because it had been given to her, but because she had put herself into it, and it had responded in kind. William James, at 2 years old, was exactly as determined and precise as his father, and exactly as curious and direct as his mother, which made him a formidable small person, who had the ranch hands charmed absolutely and Cornelius slightly off balance in the way of a man who encounters a concentrated version of his own qualities and does not know whether to be proud or alarmed. Cornelius had discovered in the time since William James's birth that he was rather good at being a father, which had surprised him and did not surprise Della at all. He was patient with the child in the specific way. He was patient with everything that required real care, not endlessly accommodating but genuinely attentive, explaining things to the boy rather than dismissing his questions, taking him along on the morning rounds when weather permitted, talking to him about the horses and the cattle and the land with the same quiet authority he brought to every subject he understood deeply. He read to the boy in the evenings, the same way he had read to Della, and William James fell asleep to the sound of his father's voice with the peaceful confidence of someone who is safe. She watched them together those evenings, and felt something so whole and complete in her chest that she had to find quiet moments to simply receive it, because it was the kind of happiness that requires acknowledgement. In the spring of 1886, their daughter was born. They named her Clara Rose Sawyer, the Rose for Doña Rosa, who had attended this birth also and who received the honor with dignified pleasure. Clara came into the world with auburn hair like her mother and enormous dark eyes, and a disposition that was immediately evident as entirely her own project, opinionated and expressive, and delighted by everything she encountered. And from the first week it was clear she would be the loudest person in the household, which was saying something given the household. "She is entirely you," Cornelius said one evening, watching Clara in Della's lap demanding attention with the unashamed confidence of someone who has never considered that attention might not be immediately available. "She is better than me," Della said. "She has not been made quiet by anything yet." "You are not quiet," he said. "I am quiet in certain ways it took me years to undo." He considered this. "She will not have those years," he said, "not if I can help it." Della looked at him and felt the particular warmth of seeing a man commit to something important without making a statement about it, simply saying it plainly and meaning it entirely. "No," she said, "she will not." James Cutter, who had become as close as family, came to meet Clara and held her with the same careful dignity he had extended to William James, and Clara looked up at him and grabbed his beard with both hands and pulled, and Cutter said, "Della, she is terrifying," with an expression of pure delight. "I know," Della said proudly. William James, at 3 years old, regarded his sister with the thoughtful evaluation of a person encountering a new variable and trying to calculate its effect on existing systems. He observed her for several days and then announced to Cornelius that he supposed she was acceptable. Cornelius relayed this to Della with perfect seriousness, and she laughed until she had to sit down. The life they had built was not simple. It was not smooth. There were hard winters and difficult cattle seasons, and ongoing complications from the land grant situation that affected the entire community and required ongoing vigilance. There were mornings when Cornelius was closed off for reasons she could not immediately identify, and she had learned over the years to give those mornings the space they required and wait, because the space always resolved into communication eventually, and the communication was always worth waiting for. There were evenings when she was short with him because she was exhausted or worried or feeling the distance from everyone she had known in Ohio, and he bore those evenings with steady patience and made her tea and did not require her to apologize for being human. They argued. Not often, but genuinely, when their strong opinions came up against each other on real questions. They argued about the management of the pasture in the third year, and he had been wrong and had admitted it without excessive drama. They argued about how much independence to give William James at 5 years old, and she had been wrong and had admitted it without excessive drama. They were fair with each other in the way he had described in that very first letter, and she had come to believe that he was right, that fairness was more reliable than sentiment, and that sentiment was most powerful when it was built on something as reliable as fairness. He told her he loved her every day, not always in words, most often not in words, but in the cup of coffee placed without comment, in the hand that found hers in the evenings without particular occasion, in the way he looked up from whatever he was doing when she entered a room, not dramatically but immediately, with a quality of attention that said she was the most interesting thing in his field of vision. He was not a man who had learned easy sentiment, and she no longer wanted him to be, because the weight of his love when he expressed it was precisely because it was not easy. She told him she loved him in words regularly, which he received with a seriousness that she found moving every single time, as though it were not expected but was always a gift. By 1887, 5 years after her arrival on the platform at Santa Fe, Barrow Creek was more than it had been when she came, not in size particularly but in warmth. The ranch had a new wing on the house, built to accommodate a growing family in New Mexico winters, with a room for William James and a room for Clara and a proper parlor where neighbors could come. Esperanza still came 3 days a week and had become so central to the household that she was family in every way that mattered, and her eldest daughter had recently begun working for them as well, a sensible young woman of 20 named Beatrice whom the children adored. Doña Rosa came for Sunday dinners when the weather permitted, and Cutter came for Sunday dinners regardless of the weather, and Reverend Pollard came sometimes too, and there were evenings when the table was full of voices, and the children were not quite manageable, and the lamplight was warm over everything, and the desert night was vast and quiet outside, and Della would look around the table at all of it and feel something she had no adequate word for. Something that encompassed every choice she had made, beginning with the choice to read James Cutter's letter twice and pack her single trunk. One such evening in the late fall of 1887, after the children were in bed and the guests had gone and the house was quiet, she and Cornelius were washing up in the kitchen by habit, standing side by side at the basin, and she said, "Do you ever think about who you would have been if you had stayed closed?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was when a question was worth taking seriously. "Sometimes," he said, "a man who managed. A man who did the work and held the land and kept everything functioning without letting anything inside the function. Would you have been content?" she asked. "I would have been," he said, "exactly what James Cutter's letter described, a stone in a chest." He paused. I did not know at the time that the stone could be something else. She turned to look at him, standing there in the kitchen of the house he had built, in the life they had built together, and he was looking back at her with the full weight of what he was, difficult and precise and honest and deeply, completely hers. "It is something else now," she said. "Yes," he said, "you made it something else." "We made it something else," she corrected. He considered this with the gravity he gave everything. "Yes," he agreed, "we did." She took the dish towel from him and set it aside and kissed him there in the kitchen by the lamplight, and he kissed her back with the full attention of a man who has learned, at some cost, to be present in his own life. And it was better than any version of romance she had imagined in Cincinnati, better by every possible measure. The following spring, she wrote to Mabel, who had by then married a good man herself and had 2 small children of her own. She wrote that 5.5 years in New Mexico territory had been more than she could have described when she left Ohio, and that the man who had been described in every letter as difficult had turned out to be the most genuinely formed person she had ever known, and that she had been right about needing texture, that smooth and easy had nothing to teach her, and that the friction of a real life with a real person was the only thing that had ever made her feel alive in all her dimensions. She wrote that William James was 4 years old and already had strong opinions about the correct way to close a gate, which he had inherited from his father and which she found secretly endearing. She wrote that Clara was 2 and had recently expressed a view about the color of her dress in terms that suggested she would not be easily argued with, which she had inherited from both her parents and which filled Della with admiration. She wrote that Cornelius had read her a poem the previous Tuesday evening, which she reported as newsworthy because it was genuinely astonishing, and because she wanted it on record in a letter with a date. She wrote that she was happy in the specific way that means you have found the right fit, the key to the right lock, the texture that your particular hands needed, and that the West was still wild enough to be interesting, and that the house was warm and the creek was running, and her husband was on the porch reading in the late afternoon light, and looking up every few minutes to see if she was still there, which she was, and intended to be for as long as there were pages left. She signed the letter with her full name, Della Hadley Sawyer, and felt the full rightness of all 3 words together, the woman she had been and the woman she had come to in this red-earthed, enormous-skied corner of New Mexico territory, where a man had been described in every letter as difficult, and she had packed her trunk and come anyway. Later that evening she came out to the porch and sat in the chair beside him, the chair that had been Louise's and was now hers in the way that living makes things yours, and he put his book down and looked at her with the full attention that was, she had come to understand, his fundamental mode of love. "Good letter?" he asked because he had seen her writing at the desk. "Very good," she said. "I told Mabel about the poem." He made the sound that was between a cough and a laugh. "I was not aware that was going to be reported." "Everything you do goes into the record," she said. "I am a woman who keeps letters." He looked at her with the warmth he no longer tried to contain. "I know," he said. "I have always known that." She leaned her head against his shoulder and he allowed it, and then he put his arm around her, and she felt the solid reality of him, the man who kept his word and kept the land and kept his grief and had finally, when the right person came and sat in Louise's chair and did not ask him to pretend it was not a sacred place, learned to keep love also. The stars came out over New Mexico territory in their extravagant numbers, the sky doing what the sky here always did, spreading itself out without apology or restraint, and the creek in the distance talked to itself in its constant murmur, and the house behind them held the sleeping children and the warmth of the fire and every year of the life they had made, and Della Sawyer sat on her porch with her husband's arm around her in the September dark and felt the complete, absolute, fully closed satisfaction of a story that had arrived exactly where it was supposed to. Neither of them said anything for a long time. There was nothing that needed to be said. Everything had been spoken in the letters, in the choices, in the years of living, in the children asleep inside, in the hand that held hers and the arm around her shoulders and the man beside her who had been described as difficult and who was, in all the most important ways, exactly that, and entirely without reservation, hers.